My name is Charles L. Brown, better known as Charlie Brown. I'm a retired Lieutenant Colonel in the United States Air Force. I spent approximately 23 years in military service and the latter 7 years as a senior foreign service officer. In my career, I spent about 15 years abroad. I started out as an enlisted man in the Army, in the West Virginia National Guard in the fall of 1939, enlisted in the regular U.S. Army in the Signal Corps in June of 1940 upon graduation from high school. Started training as a pilot in July of 1942, was commissioned as a second lieutenant pilot in April of 43. Trained as a B-17 pilot aircraft commander, went to Europe, arrived there early November of 1943, commenced combat as a B-17 pilot on 13 December 1943, flew my 29th and last complete mission on the 11th of April 1944. Combat during this period was fairly severe. I just completed a survey of my 31 attempts at missions, and every time we went into the air, we had 235 casualties during those 31 missions. And anyway, very fortunate to complete it. Ferried aircraft around the United Kingdom for 2 or 3 months, came back to the States as instructor pilot, volunteered for overseas again, and then went out to the Pacific as a C-54 pilot. Flew into China, Burma, India. Left the service December of 45, 1 year of college, very bored, back into the Army for a year, went to Japan as a military police officer and ended up commanding a counterintelligence unit. Out of the service in 1947, the fall, in order to complete college. Finished college in August of 49, recalled to active duty in October of 49, given a regular Air Force commission in early 1950, left active duty in the fall of 65, gave up my promotion to colonel to accept an appointment as a senior foreign service officer. Served 7 years with the Agency for International Development, 6 of those 7 years being spent in Southeast Asia as a regional inspector for the agency. Basically because of my counterintelligence training and police work in an outfit called Office of Special Investigations. Since I had one of the few pilot-trained investigators, I ended up doing a lot of investigations of unusual aircraft accidents in which sabotage was suspected, and as a consequence became acquainted with some outstanding scientists and worked with the Air Technical Intelligence Center on a project called Grudge. At that time, Office of Special Investigations was a worldwide investigative unit in the Air Force, and were given the responsibility of investigating what became known as unidentified flying objects. The title within the center was Project Grudge. My job was the District DO5 of Wright-Patterson. We received these worldwide reports, and my job was to hand carry these reports over to the technical center and coordinate them with the project officer, answer any questions from an investigative viewpoint that I could assist on. And I did that for approximately 2 years until the fall of 1951. When I left Wright-Patterson, Colonel Dunn was nice enough to give me a 2-page letter of appreciation for my work with Project Grudge. And so far as I know, that is certainly one of the early formal recognitions of work of an Air Force officer with Project Grudge. Now, the behind-the-scenes efforts that could have been going on simultaneously, fortunately I was not privileged to, but I did gain a feeling in that many of the investigations were never answered. Normally in the investigative field, you have an allegation of something, or in the case of a UFO, a sighting, let's say. You carry it through to its conclusion and a result. And in many of those instances, although it's been a long time ago, I do know that there were no viable scientific results. And as a consequence, it developed my interest, or it sort of piqued my curiosity, if you will, into the aspect of unidentified flying objects. Having spent several hundred hours in the air at that point, I followed it throughout the rest of my Air Force career. And in Tactical Air Command, I was the coordinating officer between the Deputy for Intelligence and Continental Army Command, which at that time had responsible for the missile defense of the United States. And so there were 2 or 3 instances in which I was called over there. Well, even though Langley was very close to Fort Monroe, normally my transit time, even with one time with the military police escort, was still about 12, 14 minutes. And when an object is moving a few thousand miles an hour, 12, 14 minutes is a tremendous amount of lost time. So I was never fortunate enough to actually see the actual tracks. But I do remember speeds in excess of 4,000 to 5,000 miles an hour, which were far in excess of any known aircraft that we had or any of the enemies. And being an intelligence officer, one of my responsibilities was to have at least a rough idea of enemy capabilities and of their equipment. We flew into, I think it was Las Vegas, Nellis Air Force Base, and another pilot and I were driving a Goonie Bird. And normally the sky out there is either very bad or very clear. And we were coming up out of there, and I glanced up and the sky was totally clear. And an object went across from probably southwest to northeast, and it transited the entire heaven. Looking at it from my right, went out of sight on the left in probably less than 15 seconds. It was moving at a speed that I couldn't even begin to calculate. It was certainly no satellite. It was not a satellite orbit. It was a controlled craft and things like that. Some of the objects reported were tracked on radar. We had objects with 4-way confirmation: ground visual, ground radar; airborne visual, airborne radar. And so far as I'm concerned, it don't get no better than that. You're not talking about someone's imagination. And in the time frame, I heard so-called experts that the Air Force brought in, and one thing and another, from swamp gas to things like that. Anyone who flies as a professional, an airline pilot, private, Air Force, Army, Navy, military, whatever, you're exposed to literally hundreds of objects in flight that are not always clearly discernible. But normally there's a flight pattern that takes place. If it's an aircraft with wings and the laws of aerodynamics apply, you don't stop that thing and reverse it in an blink of an eye. And things like that did occur. It's, I don't know, it's sort of strange, but we send people to prison. We send people to their death because of eyewitness accounts of crimes. Our legal system is based on that to a large degree. Yet, in my following of unusual aerial phenomenon for the past 50 years, there seems to be some reason to discredit very viable and very reputable witnesses when they say something is unidentified. Well, you show me the individual that can identify everything in the heavens, and I will show you the second coming. Just that simple. Because I don't care how technically qualified you are, and for someone who is not there to voice an opinion, oh, they saw such and such and such and such. Every time I see a special on UFOs or unidentified phenomena, you always have experts. And my question is, when did they get off? What was the stop that dropped them, that qualified them to be experts? And I have a real problem with that. I truly believe that phenomena have been visiting this planet long before Project Grudge. I think there's adequate evidence of it. And the more we learn about the planet, the more we learn how little we truly know. And so the advance of science is something that has to keep evolving, and we have to keep learning. And I get real discouraged when I hear people, they think they know it, if you will. The old expression is a know-it-all, when really all they are doing is expressing their ignorance without knowing it. I do not remember much of that, and I would do very little in terms of looking at gun camera film, for example. Photographs I tried to do rather well on.
But had you heard that they exist?
I had every reason to believe they existed, but I also had reason to believe that the gun camera film was handled very carefully, not for general observations. President Truman, who was a rather direct individual, they're violating airspace over the White House. And there's no question, I've seen radar photographs of organized flights of unidentified objects, balls of light, if you will. And these were on radar, ground, visual, ground radar, airborne visual, airborne radar. Now the airborne visual, strangely enough, by the time they get a couple of fighters down there, those things apparently disappeared whenever they wanted to. So anyway, back to the story. So President Truman gets involved. He sees all of the newspaper headlines and things. He says, I want the man who's responsible for investigating these things. So I think General John Samford was the Air Force Assistant Chief of Staff Intelligence. So someone said, well, General Samford is the Chief of Air Force Intelligence. So President Truman said, is he the guy that's responsible for it? Well, they said, well, yes, sir, overall, but he said, is he handling the investigation? They said, no, sir, that would be a man out of right pad. He said, that's the man I want to brief me. So I do know that they flew Ed to Washington. While I was there, they were having a NATO exercise out in the North Sea area. And a couple of these little friendly balls of light, they were having night landings, carrier landings, and they got in a traffic pattern. Well, you can imagine what happened when they came down on flew over the deck without landing, needless to say. And it threw the Navy into absolute consternation, as you can imagine. Well, the newspapers picked it up, and they were, those days, able to talk to the sailors and the airmen involved. And anyway, everyone's screaming for an investigation. They say, we have no investigative agency, blah, blah. Well, to make a long story short, some years later, the group captain I worked for retired as an Air Vice Marshal, and I ran into him. And he was Air Officer Commanding at that time, was an Air Commodore in Singapore, or in Hong Kong. Anyway, we were talking about it. And I had been told by a former, I think it was a police inspector, who went from London out there and working for the Hong Kong police. And he said that the UK agency investigating UFOs was one floor above me in the same building that I worked in for 3.5 years. And yet, they did not admit its existence. This is just the tip of the iceberg, because some of the very unusual sightings were in the UK. And they were talking about the little Foo Fighters that were over Germany. And the Germans, strangely, the Germans thought they were ours, and we thought they were Germans. Now, in the real world, balls of light do not have a place being guided by an intelligence, being airborne, and causing consternation or playing games. And this they have been known to do, i.e. the Royal Navy. And I looked up, and directly across the street to the south, I see 11 balls of light. they look like windows in an aircraft. And all of a sudden my mind is working a mile a minute. No, they're round. Aircraft windows are not round. Then they wouldn't be that large. We had 5 on top of 6, moving at a very nominal speed, maybe 300 or 400 miles an hour. And I just started to say something to my friend, look at that, whatever it is, and they turned off. They appeared and they disappeared. I was looking at the point in the sky when they appeared. They disappeared. So what do you do with it? So far as I'm concerned, that is totally inexplicable based on my judgment, my background, and my research. They are from someplace else. I do know that there are agencies of our government that can manipulate data, if you will, images, and particularly in the last 20 or 30 years, with the advent of such as I'm speaking into this beautiful digital camera. And you can create or recreate. My fascination with UFOs is based on my belief that craft, intelligently operated craft, have basically violated our laws on this planet, our physical laws. And they have done that for a long time. The fact that the government, at this point, I know we've been investigating since 1947, has not come up with an answer, to me, indicates that there's something seriously wrong. Are we this incompetent in science? I don't think so. Are we this incompetent in intelligence? I know we're not this incompetent in intelligence. Now, the image put out, Project Blue Book, when it was closed by Dr. Condon's group, I have every reason to believe that this was a total deliberate whitewash. And my judgment is that there's an excellent chance that elements of the United States government, for reasons unknown, have failed to advise the public of everything that has transpired. Investigation of UFOs. I believe that they have been investigated for an extended period of time, and that the general public is not being made aware, fully aware. Bits and pieces, programmed responses, and things like that. So it's strange that you should be interviewing me prior to a national election, because all you have to do is turn on a television set or listen to a radio, and you hear and see the results of professional programming. We make blind men see and injured people walk and things like that, and we make people talk in a certain fashion, and we give them intelligence, and we can do a lot of things. We can also hide a lot of things. I knew from engineering manuals and from research done at MIT that if you went from totally dry air to totally saturated air, you should improve the efficiency of an engine by about 2%. Well, by humidifying air, at that time, I thought it was all I was doing. I was getting 20, 30% improvement in the efficiency of an internal combustion engine. Well, engineering people and scientists just wouldn't believe it. So I went ahead, not knowing better, I started selling them. Well, some strange things started to happen, and government agencies moved in, and particularly the Federal Trade Commission. EPA was satisfied but no government support. Finally, the administrator of EPA had asked the director of their research lab in North Carolina if I ever showed up, if he would work with me. So I showed up without knowing that he had called him with a diesel vehicle. Very spectacular results in that. So far as I know, it was the first diesel ever tested in a United States EPA laboratory that simultaneously reduced all aspects of measured diesel emissions, plus improved fuel economy up to 23%. So far as I know, no one has ever equaled it. The Federal Trade Commission had performed literally an illegal act. The precise statement made to the attorney for a large dealer in Washington was, we, without identifying we, don't care whether it works or not. We just don't want people buying these large American cars. I could not, when I got that report, I couldn't imagine an officer of the United States government, this is 1979-80, saying that. I flew to Washington, went into the Congress, met the general counsel. He questioned me at length. I had documentation. He then said they would act on that. When I pointed out the unfairness of the FTC aspect by documentation, he wrote a scathing letter to the chairman of the Federal Trade Commission. Sent me a copy of it. Within 3 weeks from that date, I lost my vehicle, about $100,000 worth of equipment, a test vehicle, stolen. I had sponsored the U.S. Army race team on a little Sprite racing car. They stole my unit off of that car after we had just won the thing. The captain of the Army race team was a master sergeant in the Army. We'd created a supercar, and they stole that car from the U.S. Army in Van Nuys, California. So in 3 weeks, psychologically, I was wiped out. This is no longer just talk. There's a real world out there. And as one who had engaged in, been in and around the combat zone 9 years of my life, to have to come back to this in 15 years abroad, it was quite traumatic. So finally, after a project that I went into with the Maritime Administration, which was very successful, the conclusion was I could either add, I modified one engine on a towboat, push towboat. I could either add 20% in horsepower or 20% in fuel reduction at the same time, simultaneous with reducing emissions by 40%. Near the end of the project, 2 months before, MARAD said, our agreement's off, we're going to cancel the project. And I said, you can't do this, we've done it. I said, well, I'm going to finish the project. The agreement was 50-50. I paid for the last 2 months of the test. At this point, when I finished the project, they said, we don't want 50 copies, we're not going to distribute it, we only want 10. Not only that, we want all of your notes and all of your records. I'm saying, you really don't have a right to those. Yes, we do, we paid for them. So you don't argue with the government. So I made copies of everything I had, several copies, distributed them at various points, and sent them the originals of all of this. What I did not know at the time, I put in a call to the chief engineer who had set up the project. He was never available. The number 2 engineer was never available. So I finally called the controller. And he said, they're no longer with it. I said, what are you talking about? He said, they have eliminated the research division of the Maritime Administration. So someone did not want this concept to be successful. At 2 minutes after midnight, just into my birthday, a call come into my room. I'm just getting ready for bed. I got back from a little restaurant nearby. Please get out of your room, sir, immediately. And I said, well, if you tell me who you are and why, I'll get out. Well, this is the desk clerk, and this poor man's voice was breaking. He said, we've just got a call, there's a bomb in your room. I said, I don't think I'll discuss this any further, so I hung up, went out. Low motel, single thing. By this time, they're evacuating the whole motel. People get out, 12:30 at this point in the night. Police come, huge numbers, and the fire department, and one thing and another. And so I said, I'll check into a Holiday Inn, which I did. Parked, lighted area right in front of the front. This beat up old car. I let the outside get down, but the mechanics of it, and I had several thousands of dollars worth of equipment in. Next morning, 6:45, I look out, there's a blank space where my car was. They'd stolen my car. Police recovered it 2 or 3 weeks later. All of my test equipment. I had built a prototype carburetor. That was the last time I ever did that. I'd actually built the thing. And everything was gone. And psychologically, again, it sort of zapped me. So somebody was following me. My phone was tapped. No question about this. There was no logical reason for it. My unit was offered by this dealer free with every new American car, truck, or van purchased. I made that stipulation, it had to be American made. My concept really, I truly believe, I think I've just opened a door on a whole new field of science. This is not just my judgment, but at least 3 or 4 PhDs in physics, chemistry, and engineering. And out of air, I make it more than just providing oxygen for the combustion process. There are combustion stimulating molecules and radicals generated in this process. Thunderstorm in a bottle. My concept can work as a retrofit item on older vehicles and people who want to keep them, but particularly on the major polluting vehicles, which are 18-wheelers, diesel automobiles, the diesel cars or buses and stuff in cities, towboats, such things, ocean-going vessels even. I think the potential is for power-generating plants based on research done in Europe, in England, and by Max Planck in Germany. I have every reason to believe it can be made to work on power-generating plants. You would not even see white smoke coming out of one. I'm 90% certain this can be made to happen with a minimal investment. Had at the beginning, 25 years ago, the oil companies gotten fully behind me and whatnot, it might extend the useful life of existing oil on this planet, which is a finite source. And they have been using a substance called MTBE for years. And this, now we're just learning. Well, we've known for a long time, but early approval of that was done without any logical scientific base. It was done on a wishful basis. Let's do this and hope it doesn't hurt. Well, it hurts. So anyway, my concept adds oxygen to the air, among other things. Everything it adds is an oxidant. It helps the planet. Even CO2, when you use less fuel. CO2 is not a controlled emission. But if I can reduce it by 20%, that is going to help the ozone layer. All right? The mixtures of various gases, including CO2. So far as I know, it is probably the most fault-free concept. And in essence, I was advised by an agency of the United States government a few years ago that if I could do what I say I can do, it was a new field of science. Well, I've known it's a new field of science since I can find no competitive concepts. It's always confused, if you will, and that's a polite term, as a vapor injector or a water injector. It is neither one of those. I have used it on a vehicle with a water injector and with a vapor injector, and it still performs. Performs a function that neither one of those perform. So It is a method of enriching the combustion air or charge air on any heat cycle engine. I've tested on propane, limited testing, extensive multi-million mile testing on diesel and gasoline. I've tested on gasoline from 75 to 125 octane. I can run a vehicle that normally requires 92 octane on 75 octane without knock and perform. And I have done so for a period of 3 months. So potential, I've just scratched the surface.
They could not find any markings on the aircraft. They could not find any visible signs that the thing had wings, a tail, windows, a cockpit, or anything like that, or any markings from any country. I would describe him as being